Hey folks, Jenna Browder, myself here in studio in DC. National Day of Prayer, big obviously on Thursday, and a lot of folks going to be there. The who's who, the evangelical who's who, if you will, is in town, and one of them is with us right now. The one of the informal advisors, as part of that faith advisory group to the president, Johnnie Moore. Johnnie, great to see you, sir.
Great to be back.
Thanks for joining us, Johnnie. You know, what is the significance of this day? It comes around every year, and it brings so many people to Washington, D.C.
You know, one of my favorite phrases of President Trump is that he often says in his speeches that we are a nation of believers. You know, and this is at the heart of the American DNA, all the way going back to our founding. And you know, we are a nation founded by people who pray. It's a nation that prays. You know, in every session of Congress. And in the 1950s, Congress actually passed a mandate for a national day of prayer every single year on this day. And so in every administration since that time, it has been commemorated. It's just been commemorated in different ways. You know, so President Bush had ceremonies in the East Wing of the White House. President Obama issued proclamations. He didn't do formal events. He celebrated it privately, but he issued proclamations. And then President Trump has now, for the second year in a row, had a ceremony actually in the Rose Garden, steps outside of the Oval Office, which is it's a very big deal. It's of great symbolic significance. The only other president to do that, by the way, was Ronald Reagan one time in 1982, and the whole ceremony was like 8 minutes long. I mean, it was a meaningful thing, but it was just in and out. As it was last year, I think this year it'll be. We're going to take our time praying for the country.
I can see Donald Trump now saying, I've done it twice, Reagan's done it once. I can just see him doing that tomorrow. No, maybe he won't do that. Hey, religious freedom, the executive order, almost a year, it wasn't exactly a year ago today. What sort of progress has been made? And because evangelicals are really going to want to know what's different from a year ago.
Yeah, I think the principal thing is the purpose of that executive order, which I think has been effectively done, was to order the various departments of the government to assess where their policies were causing a problem for religious freedom across the board. You know, and we were really facing an existential moment, you know, as it relates to religious freedom. And so, practically speaking, in various parts of the government, it's affected funding decisions. It's affected a number of court cases that were undergone, you know, related to the contraception mandate have all been settled by the Department of Justice. There have been lots of these sort of material steps taken. You know, one of my critiques of the previous administrations, both the Obama and the Bush administration, is that when religious liberty intersected with difficult cultural questions, the administrations were too willing to sort of forsake religious liberty, rather than sit down and talk about, you know, we can't get rid of the first clause of the first sentence of the First Amendment. This has to exist, and I think they're definite. No one would question, you know, the commitment of religious liberty by this administration. So that wasn't an end game. That was the shot being fired in the air for a year-long race which has taken place across the whole government.
Interesting.
And when it comes to this religious liberty executive order, what role did all of you play, all of President Trump's informal faith advisors? What role, how much influence did you have in it?
Well, I don't want to overplay the role that we played, because, you know, this is an administration that has spoken to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of evangelical leaders, you know, and other faith leaders. They were interacting last year about this time. They were interacting directly with the Catholic Church on the contraception mandate and the Little Sisters of the Poor. You remember this very ceremony last year. Cardinal Wuerl walked out of the Oval Office with, you know, immediately before, you know, the ceremony, because they were having this discussion. You know, and I think that. You can't downplay the role of the evangelical community, principally because they just keep asking our advice. And we talk a lot about the door being open. You know, it was President Trump that opened the door, and he's held open the door. And there have been all these listening sessions, a great effort to try to get the voice of this, you know, of this community, and not exclusively the evangelical community. I mean, a lot of times people ask me, you know, because I'm involved in the evangelicals, is that the only thing that's going on? I can talk to you about evangelicals because that's what I'm a part of, but it's not just us. You know, they've talked to the first meeting, in fact, that I had at the White House. The very first meeting was about judicial appointments, and in that meeting were leaders from the Reformed, Conservative, and Orthodox Jewish communities. The Catholic community, the evangelical community, and the Protestant community were all represented in that one meeting, you know, alone. And this service will absolutely have a multi-faith element to it. It's going to be special.
The access that you and others have to this White House, it's been pretty extraordinary. Do you see this, has this increased over the last year or so, or would you say it got off to a bang and has stayed pretty much consistent?
It's increased. But it's become normal. I mean, this is what's interesting. Like
the new normal.
Someone asked me not long ago, is it true that an evangelical is in the White House like every week or every day or something? And my answer was, maybe like a dozen times a day. And by the way, there are a bunch of them actually working for the administration in various positions. And so, but what's also important, there's a lot of talk about who's evangelical, who isn't evangelical, what they represent, what they don't represent. And I'm always very, very clear. Like, those of us who care a lot about religious freedom, okay, and by the way, that original board to the president, from the very, very beginning, the mentality was, we were fighting for the religious freedom of everyone, not just the evangelical community and not just the Christian community, but across the board. And we've had very, very open conversations with the White House. We've agreed, we've disagreed, we've had dynamic conversations, and we're proud to have been friends, to them. And I have every reason to believe that the channels of communication will remain open.
Yeah. One person described it to us as a bus of evangelicals constantly coming in and out of the White House. Johnnie, another issue that you all are passionate about, you were here on Friday talking about prison reform. What came out of that meeting?
Right.
Well, there's, by the way, another call today. There'll be hundreds of leaders on a phone call this afternoon. The issue of prison reform and criminal justice reform more broadly is an issue that unites the evangelical community from the very, very progressive end of it all the way to the very, very conservative end of it. And in this White House, 1 year ago, this week, this very day, we had a dinner at the White House. It was attended by the President, the Vice President, and Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, and about 50 evangelical leaders. And at my table, with Jared and Ivanka and Samuel Rodriguez and Bishop Harry Jackson, and Jay Strack and Tom Mullins and Sissy Graham Lynch, we all started having a conversation about criminal justice reform and prison reform. And it turned out that it was an issue not only that evangelicals were passionate about, but the president's son-in-law and his daughter were very, very passionate about. And that began what has been a year-long conversation. It's become very, very much a bipartisan conversation. It's involved the faith community, and it's involved those outside of the faith community. And now we actually have a bill that's supported by Republican and Democrat members of Congress dealing with prison reform. And it is a really, really great piece of legislation. And I can say the evangelical community is hugely, hugely proud of the role that we've played in advancing it. The president supports the legislation. Jared Kushner deserves an enormous amount of credit for it. From square one, he's done the hard work. As a business person, this is what I like about Jared. He's a business person. So when he cared about the issue on a personal level, why? Because his father was in prison, and when his father was in prison, he went down to visit him every other weekend. He saw firsthand. He saw the challenges in our prison system, and he decided he wanted to do something about it. And here we are, as the evangelical community, as allies, along with people like Van Jones on CNN. It really is a beautiful, beautiful moment. So it's easy to talk about all the divisions and all the conflict and all these other things, and miss these moments of agreement. And this is one of those. It's not a done deal. There are challenges that have to be worked through, but it's definitely something we're encouraged by.
A couple last questions. I remember we talking at one point, and I said, so what else is on the docket? And this was why I was like, what else is left to do? I mean, there's been so much done in the first year, but what else is on the docket? In other words, what are some other things that maybe we should be looking forward to, or evangelicals should be looking forward to as it relates to this next year in the Trump administration?
When 2 or 3 days after the president's election, there were 4 of us in his office in Trump Tower discussing the evangelical community, their support, and the priorities, of the community.
The 4 of us meaning just you
and Paul
Evangelicals.
Clinton, Evangelical. So it was one of the first conversations that had been had. And we had and then we spent about a month or 6 weeks surveying leaders all across the country, and a pretty wide swath of them asking, "What are your priorities?" And we had a whole list, and I have to tell you, to our astonishment, things that we thought were going to take 2, 3, 4 years to get done, were done far, far more quickly, you know, than we ever expected. And so we did have this moment at the end of last year and the beginning of this year where we were sitting back thinking about this, well what's next? And I remember a particular conversation we had. It was after the National Prayer Breakfast. So after the National Prayer Breakfast, a deeply meaningful event, you know, every year, a handful of us went over to the White House and we had a meeting with Ivanka, and we were talking about child leave, which is an issue, again, most evangelicals support, because most evangelicals are really, really concerned about the strength of the family. You know, and so we tend to be free market people, so we don't want to do it in a way that raises taxes and increases and makes an unsustainable burden on society. But we're 100% supportive of it, so we just got to figure out how to do it. So we're having a conversation about that and all kinds of other things. You know, and somebody around the table, it's like a dozen of us or somebody, said, you know, the beautiful thing now is that we can work on the things we really care about. Because there's a degree where it felt like there was an existential threat to religious liberty. And that's not an exaggeration. When you see, you know, I live in California, you know, a few months before the presidential election, we were fighting this bill in the California State House that would have made it pretty difficult for any religious, you know, institution to, higher education institution to exist. Thankfully, the bill was withdrawn because the Archbishop of the Catholic Church in Los Angeles and Bishop Charles Blake of the Church of God in Christ opposed it, you know, because their argument was, in order to protect one community, which should be protected, by the way, you're disenfranchising the two largest minority communities that are recipients of this aid, the African American and Hispanic community. And so the bill was withdrawn. But had that bill gone through, and had the senator not done it, if he withdrew the bill, but if he'd have let it go through, it would have passed. It would have gone to the Ninth Circuit, and the replacement for Scalia, you know, if it hadn't been a Judge Gorsuch, would have probably upheld that bill. I mean, this was the trajectory this was on. 2 weeks before the election, you know, we had the Ninth Circuit uphold a state law in California, which was requiring crisis pregnancy centers to recommend abortion against their conscience. You know, I mean, this was stuff that I mean, the Obama administration was in a lawsuit with nuns, with the Little Sisters of the Poor. I mean, this is like, you know, and again, my point being, when it became difficult culturally in this country, we were too willing to forsake religious liberty rather than to think carefully and more, you know, bring a diverse group around the table and figure this out. Religious liberty doesn't matter. And so we've been fighting for these infrastructure issues, for the courts, you know, to have a view of religious liberty, a view of the Constitution, an originalist view of the Constitution, all these regulatory and other issues. Most of that all really got settled. And we sat around that table in the Executive Office building at noontime after the National Day of Prayer, and we thanked Ivanka Trump and had her send the message to her father and to the administration for the privilege now of working on the issues which we really, really care about. Not fighting for our survival, you know, as a community, but to have the full freedom to serve those who are in need, to fight for the prisoner and to fight for the poor and to work on humanitarian programs and to you know, handle all of these issues that we've all been doing anyhow. But the threat to religious liberty, in our point of view, was threatening our ability to do those things. And you know, evangelicals are in culture these days are thought of as very political. But in actuality, you know all these people, I know all these people, they spend 90% of their time outside of all that, just serving people, helping people. And that's really what we want. We just want the government to stay out of our business, let us have freedom to practice our faith, and to serve people in need. And that's the gift, you know, that this administration has given on a policy level.
Well, Johnnie, we know you've been a supporter of President Trump, and of course he's divisive, he divides. What kind of backlash have you received personally and professionally?
Well, you know, I'm not one to think about that or complain about that very much. You know, I don't. I think if you know, the Bible says if you care about the opinions of people, how can you serve Jesus? If you spend all day long caring about what people think, you'll never do the right thing. I don't care who you are, I don't care what your political beliefs are. You just can't poll check your beliefs. Secondly, you let your reputation stand for itself. You know, and this is the thing. Like people know who I am. I know who they are. You know, thirdly, within evangelicalism or Christianity as a whole these days, it seems there's a glaring lack of nuance. You know, it drives me crazy when you see, you know, I've had, you know, we know each other pretty well. If I disagreed with you on something, I wouldn't go, you know, tell it on the evening news. I wouldn't say it here with these cameras looking at me. Right. I'd pick up the phone, I'd call you.
Private discussion.
Yeah, I'd say, listen, you know, maybe you haven't thought about it this way, or maybe you have, you know, but let's have this discussion. And I think, you know, just because we have chosen on occasion to, when we have had disagreements, and we've also chosen to give credit where credit is due, you know. And I think what you have to untie this resistance mentality by some of the opponents of the president, with those of us who are principled pragmatists, right? Or sometimes I say, you know, how do I describe myself? I'm sort of a devout moderate, you know, politically. I'm devout. I believe in the Bible, in the inerrancy of Scripture, and all these things, you know. But when it comes to political issues, you know, I am. It's very hard to pin me down, you know, in certain areas. I haven't changed who I am. So if people change their point of view about me, that's out of my control. What is in my control is my own character, right? And I still raise my voice for the issues I care about. You know, I just don't, you know, I just try to be, I pray that God gives me discernment. You know, that's what I pray. You know, there's a verse in the Proverbs that says, a fool gets involved in other people's arguments. I try not to do that. You know, I'm not going to, I have no ambition to be a pundit. You know, I just want to help people.
Quick follow-up. Pains along in that process? It seems like, I mean, this has got to be, to see folks within the church kind of hashing things out in public like this, there's got to be some painful moments in that.
Well, it's, what pains me is when people misunderstand.
Okay.
I mean, this is what drives me crazy. Like, you know, it's, you know, when conflict, everyone believes what they believe for a reason, right? So we have to seek to understand that. And as Christians, we're to be peacemakers, and this is true. You know, and we're not responsible for whether or not advice is taken. You know, and I'm not even inferring the president, people in our congregation. We are responsible for the advice that we're given, you know, that we give. And yeah, I think the body of Christ actually is doing pretty great. Okay, I spend a lot of time overseas. I think, you know, the way the church is growing, we've never seen the church, you know, growing at the click it's growing, with the diversity it has. You know, the humanitarian work that, you know, when I went to northern Iraq after ISIS took Mosul and the Christians were all over the streets, like, you know, right after, a month, 6 weeks after I was there, Christians were still on the streets, in unfinished buildings, all these things. There were so few organizations there that were doing humanitarian work, but you know, one of them that was there was Franklin Graham's organization, Samaritan's Purse. You know, they had stayed after the Second Iraq War. And when they were there, they were just serving people.
And that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's the stuff like, you know, if we can reduce all of this down to, in an attempt to not be political, become the very thing that you oppose, and you drain the nuance out of the conversation, and you manufacture a crisis. And from my perspective, listen, evangelicalism is made of a lot of flawed people, and we got lots of problems to solve. There's a whole gigantic list of them, and everyone knows what they are. But why don't we solve those problems together? You know, and why don't we also recognize what's beautiful about the church at this moment in history? You'd be hard-pressed to go to any corner of the world and not find a Christian that is serving those in need, the local hospital or the school or whatever. It's, you know, we have, this is our reputation, you know, and it's interesting, you know, when the Jerusalem decision, you know, took place, and, you know, people were, you know, all in an upheaval. I was in Jerusalem 3 days after the decision, and I was there with an Arab delegation that chose to come as a peace delegation. I was back in Israel a month after that, and you know where I went? I went to Ramallah, and I sat down with Palestinian leaders. And because this is what Christians can do, because, you know, we are peacemakers, you know, and so, you know, we just can't believe the headlines about ourselves.
Very nice.
Johnnie Moore, thank you so much. It's always great to have you.
Great to be with you.
Thanks, Johnnie.
Yeah.